The message arrives after midnight. They say they are sorry, but the apology quickly becomes an explanation of their fear, their confusion, and how deeply your distance is hurting them. You know exactly what to write. One gentle sentence from you could make them feel understood again. Your fingers hover above the phone, but tonight you do not send it. A second message appears. Are you really going to leave me like this? Your throat tightens. Your mind immediately begins constructing the explanation that would soften what happened and reassure them that they are not a terrible person. But for the first time, you allow the silence to remain. They must sit with what they did without your compassion, transforming it into something easier to bear. You did not forgive them too quickly because the pain was small. You forgave them quickly because their discomfort became more urgent to you than your own. The moment they looked ashamed, lonely, confused, or afraid of losing you, your attention left the injury and moved toward helping them feel human again. This pause does not feel peaceful. It feels almost cruel, because you have spent years confusing compassion with the removal of consequence. When someone hurt you, you did not merely carry your own pain, you also carried their shame, their fear of being judged, and the story that allowed them to remain innocent in their own eyes. The change begins when explanation no longer cancels impact. You can understand their fear and still notice what they did with it. You can recognize their wounds and still see the wound they placed in you. This is the first weight returning to its owner, and it is heavier than anger because it cannot be dissolved by a beautiful interpretation. They may not know what to do when you stop translating them into someone safer. They had grown accustomed to reaching the end of a painful exchange with their self-image restored. Perhaps they apologized. Perhaps they became tender. Perhaps they offered enough regret to make you comfort them. Somehow you left carrying more than when the conversation began. That was the arrangement. They created the rupture, but you managed its emotional cost. You found the generous meaning, softened the language, reopened contact, and reassured them that they were not terrible. Your jaw remained tight long after the conversation ended. While they felt relieved because your understanding had returned them to themselves, what you called empathy was real, but it had become mixed with labor. You were not only feeling with another person, you were preventing them from fully encountering the meaning of their choices. Each time you absorbed the consequence, the relationship returned to normal without requiring the person who hurt you to become more conscious. This is why letting them carry it feels less like setting down a burden and more like committing an offense. Their unease enters the room, and every learned part of you prepares to intervene. The shoulders lift, the breath shortens, an apology begins forming in your mouth. Even when you are the one who was injured, you may tell yourself that you are being cold, yet coldness seeks to deny feeling. While this new silence may contain more feeling than your old forgiveness ever allowed, you feel the injury, their limitation, your attachment, and the cost of making it disappear. What has ended is not care. What has ended is the automatic rescue. The distinction matters because punishment and consequence are not the same. Punishment tries to create suffering. Consequence allows an existing truth to remain where it belongs. You are not placing weight on them when you stop carrying it. You are no longer interrupting the path between what they chose and what that choice now means. For a long time, you stood inside that path. If they betrayed trust, you explained their fear. If they withdrew, you blamed their confusion. If they spoke with contempt, you searched for the pain beneath it. You kept finding reasons that made their behavior understandable, then treated understanding as if it had made the behavior acceptable. The deeper reversal is difficult to admit. Your generosity did not only protect them from shame, it protected you from the grief of seeing that someone could understand your pain and still resist responsibility for causing it. As long as you kept interpreting them, you did not have to discover whether they would repair anything without being guided. Their potential became easier to love than their pattern. You listened for the person they might become if they finally felt safe enough, loved enough, or understood correctly. Meanwhile, the person standing before you kept receiving the benefits of a future self they had not yet chosen to become. You carried hope as part of their unpaid debt. So when you stop, you are not merely withdrawing effort, you are removing an invisible structure that held the relationship above its own reality. The structure was made from your explanations, second chances, softened memories, and willingness to accept intention in place of change. Without it, both of you must look at what the bond can actually support. This can make their reaction seem larger than the moment. They may accuse you of changing, becoming harsh, or refusing to see their side. What they may be feeling is not only the loss of your warmth, it is the sudden return of emotional material that your warmth used to process for them before it reached their conscious life. Through a Jungian lens, this material belongs partly to the shadow, not because it is evil, but because it contains what a person cannot include in the image they hold of themselves. Your understanding may have helped them remain kind, loyal, or wounded in their own story, while the consequences of their actions lived almost entirely inside you. When you no longer protect that image, the disowned contradiction has nowhere easy to go. They may feel misunderstood precisely when you have stopped misunderstanding what happened. They may call your clarity unfair because your former compassion quietly edited out the part of reality that threatened how they needed to see themselves. The same confrontation happens within you. You also carried an image of yourself as the one who understands, the one who does not abandon people at their worst, the one who can hold complexity when others become judgmental. There was dignity in that identity. There was also a hidden prohibition against letting another adult face you without your protection. Your chest becomes still when this prohibition begins to fail. A familiar guilt arrives before any conscious decision. It says that if they suffer under the meaning of what they did, you have caused that suffering. It does not matter that the weight existed before your silence. The old arrangement trained you to experience their discomfort as evidence of your wrongdoing. This is why their tears may undo you faster than your own. Your tears confirmed that you could endure. Theirs suggested that you had become the person causing pain. To restore your goodness, you learned to move quickly, explain gently, and reduce the moral pressure around them until their relief proved that you were compassionate again. But goodness that requires another person's consequence to disappear is not free. It asks you to become the place where every unresolved burden is stored. The anger they could not face became tension in your neck. The apology they could not complete became a conversation you rehearsed alone. The repair they postponed became your reason for waiting. Eventually, the cost appears in ordinary moments. You hear their name and become tired before anyone speaks. You notice yourself preparing evidence for an injury you no longer wish to debate. You imagine telling the truth, then immediately revise it into language they can tolerate. Even in private, your experience arrives already edited for their protection. The final act of carrying often looks like self-doubt. You ask whether it was really that serious, whether you expected too much, whether their intention should matter more. These questions can be honest. Yet, when they appear only after the other person becomes uncomfortable, they may be the old rescue returning in the voice of reason. They may ask what you want them to do, and the question can pull you back into management. You begin designing the apology, naming the lesson, and outlining the repair. Soon you are carrying not only the wound, but also the entire path by which they might become accountable for it. Even remorse becomes another task assigned to you. Real responsibility cannot be completed by the injured person on behalf of the one who acted. You can state what happened and what it changed, but you cannot manufacture their recognition. The moment you stop trying, a frightening uncertainty enters. You must wait and see what exists in them when your guidance is no longer doing the work. Letting them carry the weight does not mean deciding that your interpretation is perfect. You can remain uncertain about motives without becoming uncertain about impact. You can admit your own mistakes without using them to erase theirs. Complexity does not require every responsibility to be blended together until no one can tell who chose what. The sensitive adult often learns to enter every conflict by locating the pain beneath the behavior. This capacity can be profound. It becomes costly when understanding someone is used to avoid deciding whether their behavior is acceptable. Then empathy stops being contact with another human being and becomes a way of negotiating against your own perception. Something sober happens when that negotiation ends. You no longer need them to be monstrous in order to stop protecting them from consequence. They may be limited, frightened, affectionate, and genuinely regretful. They may also be unwilling to carry what repair demands. Holding both truths is harder than either blaming them completely or forgiving them automatically. The weight itself may be simple. It may be the silence after trust has changed. It may be the distance created by repeated indifference. It may be the knowledge that an apology without changed behavior no longer restores closeness. You do not have to add cruelty to the consequence. Reality is often heavy enough when no one is cushioning it. At first, your refusal may be almost invisible. You do not supply the reassuring sentence. You do not tell them that you know they meant well. You do not hurry to end the tension. The stomach drops, the fingers become restless, and a part of you waits for catastrophe, because you have mistaken emotional discomfort for the collapse of love. What follows may reveal more than another argument ever could. Some people begin to reflect when the consequence remains present. Others search for a new way to return it to you through blame, fragility, confusion, or urgent affection. The point is not to judge the reaction too quickly. The point is to stop performing their encounter with themselves. You are discovering that care does not require you to stand between a person and the psychological meaning of their behavior. Sometimes the most honest form of relationship is the one in which each person is allowed to feel what their own choices have created. That honesty may preserve the bond, alter it, or expose what had been holding it together. The difficulty is that you did not consciously choose this role in a single moment. It formed each time closeness was restored because you understood more, forgave sooner, or asked for less. Carrying their weight became the price of keeping love emotionally possible. Now the burden is moving back, and the old bond can feel the ground beneath it changing. When you stop carrying it, the relationship does not immediately become more honest. It becomes unstable. They wait for you to soften, explain, or reopen the conversation. You wait to see whether they will take a step without being guided. For the first time, nothing moves simply because you are willing to move it. This is the changing ground both of you had been avoiding. The relationship did not rest only on affection, history, or shared need. It also rested on your ability to absorb instability and return the bond to its familiar shape. The balance seemed natural only because your invisible effort kept correcting it before either of you had to name the imbalance. What appeared to be emotional intelligence had slowly become an assigned function. You could see several sides at once. You noticed the fear beneath defensiveness and the shame beneath anger. But the more skilled you became at finding the hidden cause, the easier it became for everyone to treat your understanding as the final stage of repair. Control can wear the appearance of compassion. It does not always command or dominate. Sometimes it anticipates every emotional danger and quietly removes it before another person must act. By carrying the weight, you gained a painful kind of power. You could keep the relationship moving even when the other person refused to move. This power rarely felt like power because it exhausted you. Still, it protected you from the helplessness of waiting. Instead of discovering whether they cared enough to reflect, apologize, or change, you could explain more clearly, remain calmer, and offer another opening. Emotional effort gave you a task when uncertainty gave you nothing to do. The arrangement often begins without any deliberate agreement. One person becomes distressed by conflict, while the other becomes skilled at resolving it. One avoids difficult recognition, while the other cannot rest until emotional order returns. Repetition turns these responses into roles, and the roles begin deciding what each person is allowed to feel. They are allowed confusion, anger, withdrawal, and delay. You are allowed patience, insight, and repair. Their distress becomes a reason to stop the confrontation. Your distress becomes evidence that you should explain yourself better. No one needs to state these rules because the relationship enforces them each time closeness returns only after you surrender your claim. The reward is immediate. Their face softens, the tension decreases. A message arrives with warmth again. The room feels breathable, your stomach releases, and for a moment the bond seems safe. That relief teaches the psyche a powerful lesson. Carrying what belongs to them appears to restore love, while leaving it untouched appears to threaten abandonment. In Jungian terms, such repetition can gather around a complex. A complex is not merely a memory. It is an emotional structure that begins reacting before conscious choice enters. The present disagreement may be new, yet the urgency feels ancient. Something in you believes that connection depends on resolving what another person refuses to hold. This does not require a dramatic beginning. Perhaps you were praised for being reasonable in a family where other feelings filled the available space. Perhaps an early relationship rewarded you whenever you accepted less. Perhaps competence at work taught you that every unresolved problem eventually became yours. Praise repeated the instruction until it felt like character. Nobody needed to call it a role for the instruction to become durable. Each approval said the same thing without words. You are most valuable when nothing remains difficult around you. People trust your steadiness, seek your advice, and admire your capacity to see beyond offense. Gradually, holding everything becomes more familiar than being the person whose hurt requires something from others. Usefulness begins to feel like the safest proof that you belong. The persona forms around this competence. It is not a lie. Your patience, perception, and generosity are genuine capacities. The problem begins when they become compulsory, when anger feels like failure, when confusion feels forbidden, and when being unable to forgive quickly threatens the entire image through which you recognize yourself. Then another person's wrongdoing creates two crises at once. There is the injury itself, and there is the danger of becoming someone who does not immediately rise above it. You are pressured not only to preserve the relationship, but also to preserve your identity as the emotionally larger person. Resentment grows beneath a goodness that cannot pause. This is how carrying the weight enters adult love. A partner avoids the difficult conversation, and you spend the night arranging language that will not provoke retreat. They offer a fragment of accountability, and you complete the rest internally. By morning, you can explain their behavior more coherently than they have ever explained it themselves. In friendship, the pattern may appear as endless context. You know why they forgot, why they disappeared, why they return only when their life becomes painful. You make room for every circumstance until your disappointment has no legitimate place to stand. The friendship continues, but the truth of how it is sustained remains mostly yours. Within family, carrying may take the form of protecting the shared story. You do not mention what would disturb the gathering. You soften one person's absence, another person's cruelty, and another person's refusal to remember. Everyone leaves believing the family passed through another encounter, while your neck stiffens from holding what could not be spoken. At work, the same structure can look admirable. Someone neglects a responsibility, and you quietly prevent the failure from becoming visible. You tell yourself that the project matters more than fairness. Yet every rescue teaches others that your reliability is available to cover their avoidance, and teaches you that peace must be purchased through extra labor. Across these settings, the central bargain remains unchanged. You receive belonging in exchange for metabolizing what the group does not want to face. They receive continuity without full recognition. You receive a place that feels secure only while you remain emotionally useful. What appears to be your gift slowly becomes the admission price for remaining close. Because affection is real, the inequality becomes harder to name. They may care for you in many ways. They may remember your preferences, defend you in public, or show tenderness when no conflict is present. This makes you question whether the burden matters. You compare their good moments with your pain and conclude that gratitude should silence complaint. But affection and accountability are different capacities. A person can feel warmly toward you and remain unable to face what their behavior creates. They can miss you deeply and still miss the function you performed more than the reality you expressed. Love does not automatically grant the strength required to encounter one's own contradiction. Your old role concealed this difference because you supplied the missing accountability. The relationship could feel more mutual than it was. You mistook the repair you completed inside yourself for repair achieved between two people. The bond appeared resilient, but its resilience depended on one person repeatedly converting injury into understanding. This conversion changed your memory. Events that once felt sharp became surrounded by explanations until you could no longer touch the original experience. You remembered their reasons more easily than your reaction. The mind preserved the relationship by reorganizing the past, while the jaw, the stomach, and the sudden fatigue retained a less generous record. Over time, you stopped asking whether they had changed and began measuring whether you could tolerate what remained. This seemed mature because it focused on your own response, yet it quietly lowered the standard of relationship from mutual responsibility to personal endurance. Your capacity to bear pain became evidence that the arrangement was acceptable. Endurance also created loyalty to the investment already made. After years of explaining, waiting, and repairing, admitting the pattern would mean confronting how much of the bond had been sustained by your effort. The next forgiveness promised to redeem the previous ones. Leaving the weight with them threatened not only the present but the meaning of everything you had given. The unconscious bargain, therefore, became self-protective. If they finally understood, your patience would become wisdom rather than postponement. If they eventually changed, your suffering would become part of a meaningful arc. Hope defended you from grieving that your labor had preserved what could not become mutual, and from admitting that patience had become a way of delaying knowledge. This is why evidence alone rarely ended the pattern. You already knew what happened. You remembered the broken promises, the evasions, and the conversations that returned to the same place. The missing element was not information. It was permission to let information have a consequence that your compassion could no longer reverse. The permission feels threatening because it removes your special function. If they must carry the result of their behavior, what remains for you to do? You cannot persuade reality into a kinder shape. You cannot guarantee repair. You become an ordinary participant in the relationship, capable of speaking and choosing, but incapable of doing another person's inner work. Ordinariness can feel like powerlessness after years of emotional management. Your hands may become restless when there is no message to compose. You may replay the conversation, searching for the sentence that could have changed everything. The impulse is not proof that you should act. It is the old function discovering that it no longer has permission to organize the moment. Their response may intensify that impulse. They may become unusually tender, offer explanations with greater urgency, or speak as if your silence has created the crisis. Because you know their pain is real, you may feel drawn to restore the familiar balance. Yet real pain does not always mean the old distribution of responsibility was just. Sometimes the weight they carry is not shame but uncertainty. They do not know whether you will return, whether the bond can resume or whether words will be enough. You once protected them from this uncertainty by reassuring them before you had understood yourself. Now they must remain inside an unanswered question that their own choices helped create. For you, the unanswered question exposes another loss. If you are no longer the interpreter, the forgiver, or the keeper of emotional continuity, you cannot rely on usefulness to confirm your place. You must discover whether the relationship can recognize you when you bring no solution, and whether affection remains when your pain is allowed to inconvenience another person. You must remain there too. Separation from the old arrangement does not give you certainty about what should happen next. It only removes the familiar method by which uncertainty was made bearable. You may miss them, question yourself, and feel tenderness toward the very person whose burden you are refusing to reclaim. This tenderness is not a failure of clarity. It is evidence that the bond was more complicated than blame. You can love what was real without continuing the function that distorted it. You can remember their humanity without using humanity as an argument against consequence. Tenderness now has to exist without becoming another method of rescue. Yet, visibility creates a question no explanation can settle. When you stop supplying their remorse, their insight, and their path back to you, what will they do with the weight that remains more painfully? What will you do if they choose to hand it back rather than carry it alone? If they hand it back, the old reflex will tell you that carrying it again is the only compassionate response. Their voice may become wounded, their confusion may sound sincere, and their loneliness may reach the part of you that has always moved toward distress. You may feel the burden returning before you have agreed to take it. Their distress still arrives inside you as a command. It returns as a question about your character. Are you really going to leave them with this? Are you becoming the kind of person who watches someone suffer and does nothing? The question conceals the original sequence. Their action created the weight, yet your refusal to remove it is presented as the moment suffering began. You are asked to answer for no longer concealing their pain from them. Your body may respond as though you are responsible. Sleep becomes shallow. Your chest tightens when the phone lights up. You compose kind explanations while doing something unrelated, then feel guilty for not sending them. The absence of rescue creates more agitation than the original injury because it violates the role that once made closeness predictable. This is where separation becomes psychologically demanding. You are not only separating from their behavior, you are separating from the version of yourself that knew what to do with it. The old role converted pain into purpose. Without that conversion, pain remains pain. With no task that can quickly turn helplessness into competence or restore your familiar value, grief appears beneath the guilt. You grieve the person you hoped they would become, but you also grieve the self you were beside them. That self could turn every disappointment into patience and every rupture into another opportunity to love well. You grieve how long your pain had to become useful before it could be acknowledged. You also grieve the possibility that all your understanding may never produce the ending you imagined. When meaning falls away, anger can arrive with unusual force. It may seem disproportionate because it contains more than the present event. It carries every conversation in which you guided them toward a recognition they later abandoned. It carries every apology you accepted before your trust had time to answer. It carries the words you swallowed because their discomfort appeared more urgent than your truth. The anger is not proof that compassion has disappeared. It may be the part of compassion that was never extended toward you. For years, your understanding moved outward immediately. Anger interrupts that movement and holds your attention near the injury. It reveals how often peace returned before your protest had been allowed to take form. Yet anger brings its own temptation. After years of protecting them from every harsh interpretation, you may want one final interpretation that condemns them completely. Certainty can feel clean after prolonged confusion. It promises to free you from tenderness, doubt, and the knowledge that someone can care for you while remaining unwilling to face themselves. This is another form of carrying. If you must turn them into a person without humanity in order to leave the consequence with them, they still govern your inner life. Your judgment becomes responsible for holding the boundary. The moment your judgment softens, you fear the entire structure will collapse. Then one tender memory is enough to make the burden feel like yours again. A more difficult clarity does not require hatred. It allows the facts to remain meaningful even when affection returns. You may remember their warmth and hear genuine regret in their voice. You may understand why accountability frightens them. You can hold all of this without completing what only they can complete. Tenderness can exist beside consequence without being used to dissolve it. The shadow now appears on your side of the bond. This recognition must remain exact. You did not cause their choices, and your adaptation does not make the harm equally shared. Yet, you repeatedly converted their choices into work you could perform because work felt safer than waiting to discover whether they would choose you freely. Being indispensable offered protection. If they needed your patience, insight, and emotional steadiness, perhaps they could not easily leave. Their dependence on your function appeared to secure your place. What you called devotion was sincere, but part of you was also making attachment less uncertain by becoming too useful to lose. Anticipation provided another protection. By noticing their needs before they spoke, you rarely had to expose your own. You could hope that someone would recognize your pain without being told, then feel wounded when they did not. Indirect need preserved dignity, but it made recognition depend on a test the other person may never have known they were taking. None of this means your generosity was false or calculating. The hidden bargain formed beneath intention. Your care served love, but it also protected you from asking whether you would still be loved when you offered no solution, carried no crisis, and arrived only as your unedited self. Being needed felt safer than standing before another person with needs they were free to refuse. As long as you were the emotionally capable one, your own dependency could remain hidden. You did not have to say that you wanted reassurance, repair, consistency, or care. You could focus on what they lacked. Their limitation filled the relationship so completely that your longing appeared only as disappointment, never as a vulnerable request. This does not excuse their refusal. It explains why the arrangement survived after its cost became visible. Their avoidance of accountability and your avoidance of helplessness supported the same bond in different ways. Each person was protected from a truth neither wanted to meet directly. The relationship could continue because neither person had to discover what would happen without the old roles. Once this becomes visible, the old forgiveness loses some of its innocence. You may notice that forgiving quickly also prevented a real answer from emerging. If you restored contact before they showed what they could carry, you never had to receive the answer that their inaction might have given. Repair remained possible because it was never fully tested. You protected hope by interrupting evidence. Each rescue kept possibility alive for another day, yet possibility without consequence asked you to remain suspended between what had happened and what might still change. What remained untested was their capacity to choose accountability when your attachment was no longer guaranteed. Now that interval begins to close. The person before you must be encountered through what they repeatedly choose, not only through what they feel or promise. Your mind may resist this simplicity because it seems unfair to reduce a complex human being to behavior. But you are not reducing them, you are allowing behavior to count. Allowing it to count may alter your memories of the bond. Moments you once called misunderstandings begin to look like patterns. Acts you dismissed as weakness reveal a consistent transfer of cost. This does not erase the good or make every tender moment false. It changes the proportion of reality that the good is permitted to conceal. The social cost can begin before any formal decision. You answer less quickly because you no longer know how to speak without returning to the old function. You feel tired after brief contact. Your eyes move toward the exit when the conversation turns once again toward their pain about the pain they caused. Then your silence is treated as the greater injury. They may sense the withdrawal and become more attentive. This attention can feel like the recognition you waited years to receive. Your shoulders drop, and hope rises before thought can examine it. Yet attention produced by the threat of consequence is not the same as a developed capacity to remain accountable after the threat has passed. The distinction cannot be proven immediately. People sometimes change when reality finally reaches them. They also sometimes adapt just enough to restore access. You cannot know at once which movement you are witnessing. The old role demands a quick verdict because uncertainty feels unbearable, but this moment requires you to stop deciding for both of you. Waiting without rescuing is different from waiting for potential. Previously, waiting meant extending credit against a future transformation. Now it means allowing conduct to reveal what words cannot establish. You are no longer holding the relationship open through imagination. You are observing whether the other person can participate in keeping it open. This may produce loneliness even while they remain present. Conversation continues, but the invisible labor has stopped. Silences appear where your explanations once stood. You notice how little movement occurs when you do not create it. You begin to hear the absence of the mutuality your labor once seemed to provide. You may be tempted to call that loneliness a mistake. The bond felt warmer when you carried more. Messages came more easily. Conflict ended faster, and affection returned sooner. Yet warmth created by your self-removal was never free. It required you to leave your own experience outside each time you re-entered the relationship. Another guilt emerges when you notice relief. Part of you feels lighter because their crisis is no longer your assignment. Then you judge the relief as evidence that you never loved them properly, but relief does not deny love. It reveals how much of what you called love had become compulsory emotional responsibility. Relief may be followed by emptiness, hours once occupied by analyzing their motives and preparing the next conversation have no immediate purpose. The mind reaches for the familiar problem because the problem organized your attention and confirmed your importance. Without it, you encounter desires, friendships, and ordinary decisions that received only what remained after their inner world took priority. Attention is returning to a life that has waited. At first, this return may feel less like freedom than the loss of an identity. Their burden gave structure to your days and offered visible proof that you mattered. Leaving it with them means accepting that your worth cannot be measured by how much difficulty you prevent. The old function disappears before another way of belonging has become familiar. At this stage, there is no clean emotional position. You may feel compassion in the morning, anger by afternoon, and grief when the day becomes quiet. None of these feelings provides a final instruction. They reveal different truths about a bond that contained love, injury, usefulness, dependence, and hope at the same time. The task is not to become untouched. It is to stop allowing each feeling to redistribute responsibility. Missing them does not mean the weight is yours. Understanding them does not make repair your assignment. Feeling anger does not require punishment. Love may remain without being permitted to decide where responsibility must live. For perhaps the first time, the burden remains visible between you. They have not yet shown whether they can carry it, and you have not yet learned who you are when you refuse. The old certainty can no longer return. The relationship cannot fully become what it was, but no new form has proven possible. Both truths remain, and neither can be softened away. The next time it happens, the moment is almost disappointingly ordinary. A message arrives asking whether you are still angry. A relative waits for you to make the gathering comfortable again. Someone offers an apology that explains their pain more carefully than it acknowledges yours. You feel the familiar sentence forming, but this time you do not use it to rescue the moment. Nothing dramatic follows. You answer without reassurance, leave without repairing, or allow the silence to remain unfinished. The shift becomes real through moments that no longer end in your surrender. What changes is not the amount of compassion you feel. What changes is what your compassion is permitted to erase. You no longer provide the generous interpretation that returns everyone to comfort. You do not turn regret into proof of change. You let an apology remain incomplete when it avoids the actual injury. Nothing spectacular happens, yet the old emotional machinery begins to lose its operator. Other people may experience this as a change in your personality. They may say that you used to be warmer, easier to speak with, or more willing to see complexity. Their observation may contain some truth. You are less available to complexity when complexity is being used to make responsibility disappear. What they call hardness may be your refusal to confuse nuance with exemption. They may genuinely miss you. Not every protest is manipulation, and not every expression of hurt is an attempt to control. Some will grieve the loss of a closeness they experienced as real. What they may not understand is that the closeness required you to absorb consequences they were never asked to notice. This is why you can feel sorrow without returning. Their grief may be sincere, and the old arrangement may still be impossible. Love can exist inside a structure that asks too much from one person. The presence of love does not settle whether the structure can continue. Sorrow no longer functions as automatic permission to restore what injured you. In family life, the reaction may arrive through small accusations. You are making things awkward. You are holding on to the past. You no longer know how to let things go. Beneath these words may be a deeper disturbance. The person who once converted injury into harmony has allowed harmony to reveal its unpaid cost. The family may call this resentment, because resentment is easier to name than redistribution. If you no longer explain one person's absence or cover another person's disregard, the discomfort becomes collective. What lived privately inside you begins to appear in the room where it was created. The family must now feel what your old role prevented it from feeling. Some people will respond by approaching you differently. They may ask what happened without immediately defending themselves. They may tolerate the pause after your answer. They may discover that accountability is not humiliation. It is the capacity to remain present while another person's experience changes how they understand their own behavior. Others may become more determined to restore the former balance. They may repeat the apology with greater emotion, remind you of everything good between you, or describe your refusal as an attack. Their distress may be real, yet intensity does not decide who should carry the consequence. Emotional urgency cannot transform your clarity into an act of cruelty. Your body will still react. A familiar tone may tighten your neck before you recognize the demand. A tender message may soften your chest and awaken the wish to make everything gentle again. These responses do not mean the old role has returned. They show that the role remembers how belonging once became available. There may be moments when you take the burden back. You over-explain, reassure too soon, or accept an answer that leaves the central truth untouched. Later, the fatigue arrives, and you realize what happened. This does not erase the shift. A pattern formed through repetition may also loosen through repeated recognition. The difference is that you can now feel the transfer. You notice the exact moment their discomfort becomes your assignment. You hear yourself moving away from impact and toward intention. The movement that once looked like love becomes visible as movement. What becomes visible can no longer pass entirely as instinct. This visibility changes the way you receive an apology. You stop listening only for remorse and begin noticing capacity. Can they name what happened without making you soften it? Can they hear what changed without demanding immediate restoration? Can they remain present after forgiveness is no longer offered as relief? The answers may be mixed. A person may understand one day and retreat the next. They may carry part of the weight, but reject the portion that threatens their preferred image. Human accountability is rarely pure. The question is whether the movement is real enough to create a relationship that no longer depends on your disappearance. Consistency matters because remorse can be sincere without becoming capacity. A person may feel ashamed in the moment and still return to avoidance when the emotional pressure passes. They may cry, confess, or speak with unusual tenderness. None of this is meaningless, but only repeated conduct reveals whether recognition has become something they can carry. You may also have responsibilities that belong to you. Perhaps you spoke indirectly, waited too long, or expected them to perceive needs you never expressed. Perhaps accumulated resentment sharpened your words. Recognizing these parts does not require you to reclaim their share. Mutual responsibility becomes possible only when responsibility remains distinct. This distinction protects you from moral superiority. You are not the conscious person standing above someone who failed. You are a participant who has begun to see the arrangement more fully. Your insight does not make you innocent of every contribution. Complexity, however, does not make all contributions equal. Through a Jungian lens, this is a movement toward less division within the personality. The patient and understanding persona no longer has to contain the whole of your goodness. Anger, refusal, uncertainty, and need can enter consciousness without becoming proof that you have lost your humanity. Compassion becomes one capacity among many instead of the identity that silences all others. The shadow no longer needs to seize the relationship through contempt because it has been given a more honest place. It can say that something was unfair. It can admit that care became resentment. It can recognize that part of you wanted to be indispensable. What is brought into consciousness no longer has to govern through exhaustion. Ordinary conversations begin to reveal the change. When a friend explains why they disappeared, you can hear the